Disclaimer. This video is for entertainment and informational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the creator and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization. The creator of this video is not responsible for any errors or omissions, or for any actions taken based on the information presented in this video. Viewer discretion is advised. In the previous episode, we introduced several scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, including Einstein, Szilard, Seaborg, Fermi, and Groves. Furthermore, we can't forget about Oppenheimer, often referred to as the father of the atomic bomb. These individuals were responsible for the creation of the atomic bomb, as I mentioned before. The background of the entire event is that the U.S. government was not just concerned about Germany. Despite being allies with the Soviet Union during the war, Americans had a deep mistrust of the Soviets and didn't want them to gain access to nuclear technology. In fact, based on historical records, the Soviets had their ways of acquiring information about the U.S. research on atomic bombs through espionage. This ultimately led to Oppenheimer's suppression by the U.S. government after the war. All of these factors are related to his association with the left wing. Continuing the story of the project's inception, as we mentioned before, the military was primarily in charge of nuclear research in the United States at that time. Therefore, the government gave the highest priority to the military for this reason. It is important to remember that even during the early stages of this project, we have already seen the emergence of issues such as the shadow government, deep state, and the involvement of military-industrial complex. Therefore, you will find that the entire affair was shrouded in secrecy. In our previous episode, we mentioned military leader Vannevar Bush. In fact, he was responsible for initially renaming the project as the Substitute Materials Development Laboratory. Later on, he renamed it the Manhattan Project. General Leslie Groves was in charge of the overall operation. However, he was not involved in the initial phase of the project. Initially, the Manhattan Project recruited numerous physicists, chemists, engineers, and even military personnel. Even citizens from certain regions were involved in various tasks. Although they had a theoretical understanding of the process, they were not familiar with the practical aspects. This was because of a crucial reason. They didn't know which of the three methods for uranium-235 nuclear fusion would yield the best results. Therefore, during the research and development phase, all three methods were pursued simultaneously. Based on the available information, the scale of this project was vast. In the entire Manhattan Project, there were a total of 16 branch projects. The main research efforts were divided into 4 parts. The first was the nuclear reactor project led by Fermi, followed by the nuclear materials production facility led by Pupin. There was also a nuclear materials production facility led by Seaborg, located at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. These research and development works took place in New Mexico. Subsequently, these projects gradually evolved into another section within Area 51. That's another story altogether. In September 1942, Groves initiated the first phase of the Manhattan Project. One of his initial tasks was to acquire land, which was done through purchasing from private citizens rather than military seizure. One of the locations acquired was Oak Ridge in Tennessee. At this site, two major projects began: the electromagnetic and gaseous diffusion plants, which were used for uranium isotope separation. There were two separate sections at this location. In the same year, Fermi decided to build a laboratory for studying reactors in the basement of a university. Although it was referred to as a basement, it was actually quite large and not a typical basement. It required a ventilation system and appropriate temperature control. In fact, the temperature inside was usually lower than our normal body temperature, creating a cool environment. It was located on the west side of what was then a football field, making it less conspicuous. One of the most significant locations was the site in Chicago where the research reactor was conducted. It was also one of the most challenging aspects of the Manhattan Project. Technicians had to take turns placing graphite bricks continuously for 24 hours. Only when one scientist's shift ended did another take over. In fact, one scientist once remarked, "You know, it's crazy. We're spending $1.5 million of the taxpayers' money, and we're doing brute work like this." It's unimaginable how difficult it was during the early stages of construction. It wasn't until December 2, 1942, after the reactor was essentially completed, that they began conducting nuclear fission experiments. At that time, Fermi began to manipulate the control rods and, on the so-called neutron counter, heard the sound indicating the start of a series of upward-moving recording lines. This marked the first human-controlled nuclear reaction in history. The specific time was December 20, 1942, at 3:25. The nuclear reaction experiment lasted for 28 minutes and concluded at 4:04 p.m. This experiment validated the theory of a chain reaction and provided a crucial foundation for the development of the atomic bomb. During the experiment, several scientists bravely climbed onto the platforms, overseeing the progress of the reaction, ready to quickly pour several buckets of cadmium solution into the reactor in case the experiment went out of control to stop the neutron reaction and prevent a nuclear explosion. One can imagine the dramatic scene this created. It wasn't until the spring of 1943 that the team of scientists, led by our central figure today, J. Robert Oppenheimer, at the Los Alamos base, began the most mysterious and dangerous engineering project ever undertaken by the U.S. government: the manufacturing of an atomic bomb. Various facilities such as Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos started operating as a series of factories. By 1943, over 30 American companies were involved in the Manhattan Project. During its peak, the Manhattan Project employed over 600,000 personnel. This was due to the strict secrecy and control requirements imposed by the military. You see, they essentially isolated all personnel involved in the project, keeping them unaware of anything beyond their assigned tasks. They simply followed instructions without knowing the specifics of what they were doing or why. The time has come for this episode to end. Stay tuned for the next episode to continue the Manhattan Project. Don't miss it.